Chapters 14 and 15 of the history of Rome from the earliest times down to 476 A.D. by Robert F Pennell. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Part 5. Chapter 14, the Second Punic War, from the passage of the Pyrenees to the Battle of Cannae, 218 to 216. In the spring of 218, Hannibal started from Carthago Nova to invade Italy. His army consisted of 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 elephants. His march to the Pyrenees occupied 2 months, owing to the opposition of the Spanish allies of Rome. Hannibal now sent back a part of his troops, retaining 50,000 infantry and 9,000 cavalry, all veterans. With these he crossed the mountains and marched along the coast by Narbonne and Nemansus, Nimes, through the Celtic territory with little opposition. The last of July found him on the banks of the Rhone opposite Avignon. The Romans were astonished at the rapidity of his movements. The consuls of the year were Scipio and Sempronius. The former had been in northern Italy, leisurely collecting forces to attack Hannibal in Spain. The latter was in Sicily, making preparations to invade Africa. Scipio set sail for Spain, touching at Massilia near the end of June. Learning there for the first time that Hannibal had already left Spain, he hoped to intercept him on the Rhone. The Celtic tribes of the neighborhood were won over to his side. Troops collected from these were stationed along the river, but Scipio's main army remained at Massilia. It was Hannibal's policy to cross the river before Scipio arrived with his troops. He obtained all the boats possible and constructed numerous rafts to transport his main body of troops. A detachment of soldiers was sent up the river with orders to cross at the first available place and, returning on the opposite bank, to surprise the Celtic forces in the rear. The plan succeeded. The Celts fled in confusion, and the road to the Alps was opened. Thus Scipio was out-generaled in the very beginning. His course now should have been to return to northern Italy with all his forces, and take every means to check Hannibal there. Instead, he sent most of his troops to Spain under his brother Gnaeus Scipio, and himself, with but a few men, set sail for Pisae. Meanwhile, Hannibal hurried up the valley of the Rhone, across the Isara, through the fertile country of the Allobroges, arriving in 16 days from Avignon, at the pass of the first Alpine range, Mont du Chat. Crossing this with some difficulty, owing to the nature of the country and the resistance of the Celts, he hastened on through the country of the Centrones, along the north bank of the Isara. As he was leaving this river and approaching the pass of the Little St. Bernard, he was again attacked by the Celts, and obliged to make the ascent amidst continual and bloody encounters. After toiling a day and a night, however, the army reached the summit of the pass. Here, on a tableland, his troops were allowed a brief rest. The hardships of the descent were fully as great, and the fertile valley of the Po was a welcome sight to the half-famished and exhausted soldiers. Here they encamped in September and recruited their wearied energies. This famous march of Hannibal from the Rhone lasted 33 days, and cost him 20,000 infantry and 3,000 cavalry. The Romans were still unprepared to meet Hannibal. One army was in Spain under Gnaeus Scipio. the other in Sicily, on its way to Africa, under the consul Sempronius. The only troops immediately available were a few soldiers that had been left in the valley of the Po to restrain the Gauls, who had recently shown signs of defection. Publius Cornelius Scipio, upon his return from Massilia, took command of these. He met Hannibal first in October 218 near the river of Ticinus, a tributary of the Po. A cavalry skirmish followed, in which he was wounded and rescued by his son, a lad of 17, afterwards the famous Africanus. The Romans were discomfited, with considerable loss. They then retreated, crossing the Po at Placentia, and destroying the bridge behind them. Hannibal forded the river farther up, and marched along its right bank until he reached its confluence with the Trebia, opposite Placentia. Here he encamped. Meanwhile, Sempronius, who had been recalled from Sicily, relieved the disabled Scipio. Early one raw morning in December 218, the vanguard of the Carthaginians was ordered to cross at the Trebia, and as soon any resistance was met, to retreat. The other troops of Hannibal were drawn up ready to give the enemy a hot reception if, as he expected, they should pursue his retreating vanguard. Sempronius was caught in the trap, and all his army except one division of 10,000 was cut to pieces. The survivors took refuge at Placentia and Cremona, where they spent the winter. Sempronius himself escaped to Rome. The result of Trebia was the insurrection of all the Celtic tribes in the valley of the Po, who increased Hannibal's army by 60,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry. While the Carthaginian was wintering near Placentia, the Romans stationed troops to guard the two highways leading north from Rome and ending at Arretium and Arminum. The consuls for this year were Gaius Flaminius and Gnaeus Servilius. The former occupied Arretium, the latter Ariminum. Here they were joined by the troops that had wintered at Placentia. In the spring, Hannibal, instead of attempting to pursue his march by either of the highways which were fortified, outflanked the Romans by turning aside into Etruria. His route led through a marshy and unhealthy country, and many soldiers perished. Hannibal himself lost an eye from ophthalmia. When he had arrived at Thessaly, a report of his course first reached Flaminius, who at once broke camp and endeavored to intercept his enemy. Hannibal, however, had the start, was now near Lake Trasimenus. Here was a pass with a high hill on one side and the lake on the other. Hannibal, with the flower of his infantry, occupied the hill. His light-armed troops and horsemen were drawn up in concealment on either side. The Roman column advanced, May 217, without hesitation to the unoccupied pass. The thick morning mist completely concealing the position of the enemy. As the Roman vanguard approached the hill, Hannibal gave the signal for attack. The cavalry closed up the entrance to the pass, and at the same time the mist rolled away, revealing the Carthaginian arms on the right and left. It was not a battle, but a mere rout. The main body of the Romans was cut to pieces, with scarcely any resistance, and the consul himself was killed. 15,000 Romans fell, and as many more were captured. The loss of the Carthaginians was but 1,500, and was confined mostly to the Gallic allies. All Etruria was lost, and Hannibal could march without hindrance upon Rome, whose citizens, expecting the enemy daily, tore down the bridges over the Tiber and prepared for a siege. Quintus Fabius Maximus was appointed dictator. Hannibal, however, did not march upon Rome, but turned through Umbria, devastating the country as he went. Crossing the Apennines, he halted on the shores of the Adriatic at Picenum. After giving his army a rest, he proceeded along the coast into southern Italy. The Romans, seeing that the city was not in immediate danger, raised another army and placed the dictator in command. Fabius was a man of determination and firmness, well advanced in years. He determined to avoid a pitched battle, but to dog the steps of the enemy, harassing him and cutting off his supplies as far as possible. Meanwhile, Hannibal again crossed the mountains into the heart of Italy, Beneventum, and from there to Capua, the largest Italian city dependent upon Rome. The dictator followed, condemning his soldiers to the melancholy task of looking on in inaction, while the enemy's cavalry plundered their faithful allies. Finally, Fabius obtained what he considered a favorable opportunity for an attack. Hannibal, disappointed in his expectations that Capua would be friendly to him, and not being prepared to lay siege to the town, had withdrawn towards the Adriatic. Fabius intercepted him near Casilinum in Campania, on the left bank of the Volturnus. The heights that commanded the right bank of the river were occupied by his main army, and the road itself, which led across the river, was guarded by a strong division of men. Hannibal, however, ordered his light-armed troops to ascend the heights over the road during the night, driving before them oxen with burning faggots tied to their horns, giving the appearance of an army marching by torchlight. The plan was successful. The Romans abandoned the road and marched for the heights, along which they supposed the enemy were going. Hannibal, with a clear road before him, continued his march with the bulk of his army. The next morning he recalled his light-armed troops, which had been sent on to the hills with the oxen. Their engagement with the Romans had resulted in a severe loss to Fabius. Hannibal then proceeded without opposition in a northeasterly direction by a very circuitous route. He arrived in Luceria with much booty and a full money chest at harvest time. Near here he encamped in a plain rich in grain and grass for the support of his army. At Rome, the policy of Fabius was severely criticized. His apparent inaction was displeasing to a large party, and he was called Cunctator, the delayer. At length the assembly voted that his command be shared by one of his lieutenants, Marcus Minucius. The army was divided into two corps, one under Marcus, who intended to attack Hannibal at the first opportunity, the other under Fabius, who still adhered to his former tactics. Marcus made an attack, but paid dearly for his rashness, and his whole corps would have been annihilated had not Fabius come to his assistance and covered his retreat. Hannibal passed the winter of 217 to 216 unmolested. The season was spent by the Romans in active preparations for the spring campaign. An army of 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry was raised and put under the command of the consuls Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. It was decided to test Hannibal's strength once more in open battle. His army was only half as strong as the Roman in infantry, but was much superior in cavalry. In the early summer of 216, the consuls concentrated their forces at Cannae, a hamlet near the mouth of the Aufidus. Early one morning in June, the Romans massed their troops on the left bank of the river, with their cavalry on either wing, the right under Paulus and the left under Varro. The proconsuls Servilius commanded the center. The Carthaginians were drawn up in the form of a crescent, flanked by cavalry. Both armies advanced to the attack at the same time. The onset was terrible, but though the Romans fought with a courage increased by the thought that their homes, wives, and children were at stake, they were overwhelmed on all sides. 70,000 fell on the field, among whom were Paulus, Servilius, many officers, and 80 men of senatorial rank. This was the most crushing defeat ever experienced by the Romans. All southern Italy, except the Latin colonies and the Greek cities on the coast, went over to Hannibal. Chapter 15. The Second Punic War, from Cannae to the Battle of Zama, 216 to 202. Rome was appalled, but though defeated, she was not subdued. All the Latin allies were summoned for aid in the common peril. Boys and old men alike took up arms. Even the slaves were promised freedom if they would join the ranks. Hannibal marched from Cannae to Campania. He induced Capua, the second city of Italy, to side with him. But his expectations that other cities would follow her example were not fulfilled. He went into winter quarters here, 215 to 214. The Capuans, notorious for their luxurious and effeminate habits, are said to have injured his soldiers. But Hannibal's superiority as a general is unquestionable, and his want of success after this was due to insufficient aid from home and to the fact that the resources of Rome were greater than those of Carthage. The Latin allies of Rome had remained true to their allegiance, and only one city of importance was under his control. It was an easy matter to conquer the enemy in open battle, but to support his own army was more difficult, for all Italy had been devastated. On the other hand, the Romans were well supplied with food from their possessions in Sicily. Hannibal saw, therefore, that more active measures than those already employed were necessary. He sent to Carthage an appeal for aid. He formed an alliance with Philip V of Macedonia, and earnestly urged Hasdrubal Barca, his lieutenant in Spain, to come to his assistance. He hoped, with his army from the north, with supplies and reinforcements from Carthage, and with such troops as he might obtain from Macedonia, to concentrate a large force at Rome and compel her into submission. The Romans, realizing the position of Hannibal, kept what forces they could spare in Spain, under the two Scipio brothers, Publius and Gnaeus. With these, they hoped to stop reinforcements from reaching the enemy from that quarter. At the same time, their army in northern Greece effectually engaged the attention of Philip. Thus 2 years, 214 to 212, passed without any material change in the situation of affairs in Italy. In 212, while the Carthaginians were in the extreme south of Italy, besieging Tarentum, the Romans made strenuous efforts to recover Campania, and especially Capua. Hannibal, learning the danger, marched rapidly north, and failing to break through the lines which enclosed the city, resolved to advance on Rome itself. Silently and quickly he marched along the Via Latino, through the heart of the territory of Rome, to within 3 miles of the city, and with his vanguard he even rode up to one of the city gates. But no ally joined him. No Roman force was recalled to face him. No proposals of peace reached his camp. Impressed by the unmoved confidence of the enemy, he withdrew as quickly as he came and retreated to his headquarters in the south. Capua fell in 211, and the seat of war, to the great relief of Rome, was removed to Lucania and Bruttium. The punishment inflicted upon Capua was severe. 70 of her senators were killed, 300 of her chief citizens imprisoned, and the whole people sold as slaves. The city and its territory were declared to be Roman territory, and the place was afterwards repeopled by Roman occupants. Such was the fate of this famous city. Founded in as early times as Rome itself, it became the most flourishing city of the Magna Graecia, renowned for its luxury and refinement, and as the home of all the highest arts and culture. Affairs in Sicily. Hiero II, tyrant of Syracuse, died in 216. During his long reign of more than 50 years, he had been the staunch friend and ally of Rome in her struggles with Carthage. Hieronymus, the grandson and successor of Hiero, thought fit to ally himself with Carthage. The young tyrant, who was arrogant and cruel, was assassinated after reigning a few months. The Roman governor of Sicily, Marcellus, troubled by the Carthaginian faction in Syracuse, threatened the city with an attack unless the leaders of this faction were expelled. In return, they endeavored to arouse the citizens of the neighboring city of Leontini against Rome and the Roman party in Syracuse. Marcellus at once attacked and stormed Leontini. The Syracusans then closed their city gates against him. A siege of 2 years, 214 to 212, followed, famous for the various devices adopted by the noted mathematician Archimedes. Footnote: Archimedes was a great investigator in the science of mathematics. He discovered the ratio of a sphere to its circumscribed cylinder. One of his famous sayings was, "Give me where to stand, and I will move the world." He exerted his ingenuity in the invention of powerful machines for the defense of Syracuse. 8 of his works on mathematics are in existence. He was killed at the close of the siege by a Roman soldier, who would have spared his life had he not been too intent on a mathematical problem to comply with the summons to surrender. On his tombstone, it is said, was engraved a cylinder enclosing a sphere. End of footnote. To defeat the movements of the Romans. The city was finally betrayed by a Spanish officer and given up to plunder. The art treasures in which it was so rich were conveyed by Marcellus to Rome. From this time, 212, the city became a part of the province of Sicily and the headquarters of the Roman governor. The campaigns in Spain. Publius Cornelius Scipio, with his brother Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio Calvus, were winning victories over the Carthaginians under Hanno and Hasdrubal. The greatest of these was fought in 215 at Iberia, the location of which is uncertain. Spain was gradually being gained over Rome, when the Carthaginians, making desperate efforts, sent large reinforcements there in 212. The armies of the Scipios were separated, surprised, and overwhelmed. Both their leaders were slain, and Spain was lost to Rome. Unless checked, the Carthaginians would now cross the Alps, enter Italy, and, joining forces with Hannibal, place Rome in great danger. Publius Cornelius Scipio, son of one of the slain generals, then but 24 years of age, offered to go to Spain and take command. He had previously made himself very popular as aedile, and was unanimously elected to the command. On his arrival in Spain in 210, he found the whole country west of the Ebro under the enemy's control. Fortunately for the Romans, the three Carthaginian generals, Hasdrubal and Mago, brothers of Hannibal, and Hasdrubal, son of Gisco, did not act in harmony. Thus Scipio was enabled, in the following spring, 209, to capture Carthago Nova, the headquarters of the enemy. A good harbor was gained, and 18 ships of war, 63 transports, $600,000, and 10,000 captives fell into the hands of the Romans. Shortly after, Scipio fought Hasdrubal, the brother of Hannibal, at Baculae, in the upper valley of the Baetis, Guadalquivir. But the battle was not decisive, for Hasdrubal was soon seen crossing the Pyrenees with a considerable force on his way to Italy. He spent the winter 209 to 208 in Gaul. The two Carthaginian generals now in Spain, Mago and Hasdrubal, the son of Gisco, retired, the latter to Lusitania, the former to Baleares, to wait for reinforcements from home. The next year another battle was fought near Bacula, resulting in the total defeat of the Carthaginians, who retreated to Gades in the southwestern part of Spain. The country being now 206 under Roman influence, Scipio crossed the straits to Africa and visited the Numidian princes, Sphinx and Massinissa, whom he hoped to stir up against Carthage. On his return, after quelling a mutiny of the soldiers, who were dissatisfied about their pay, he resigned his command and started for Rome, where he intended to become a candidate for the consulship. Operations in Italy. The news of the approach of Hasdrubal caused intense anxiety in Rome. Every nerve was strained to prevent the union of the two brothers. The consuls for this year, 207, were Gaius Claudius Nero, a patrician, and Marcus Livius, a plebeian. To the former was entrusted the task of keeping Hannibal in check in Bruttium, while the duty of intercepting Hasdrubal was given to the latter. Carthaginian had already reached the neighborhood of the river Metaurus, a small stream south of the Rubicon. From here he sent messengers to inform his brothers of his approach and proposed line of march. These messengers were captured by Nero, and the contents of their dispatches learned. He at once pushed north with his forces, joined Livius, met Hasdrubal on the Metaurus early in 207, and defeated his army with great slaughter. Among the slain was Hasdrubal himself. Nero returned south without delay, and the first intimation that Hannibal had of this battle was the sight of his brother's head thrown into the camp by the victorious foe. The war in Italy was now virtually ended, for although during 4 years more Hannibal stood at bay in a corner of Bruttium, he was powerless to prevent the restoration of Roman authority throughout Italy. Nothing now remained to Carthage outside of Africa, except the ground on which Hannibal was making his last stand. Invasion of Africa. Scipio, on his return from Spain, urged an immediate invasion of Africa. He was elected consul in 205, receiving Sicily as his province. With permission to cross into Africa, it seemed to him wise. He was so popular that voluntary contributions of men, money, and supplies poured in from all sides. The old-fashioned aristocracy, however, did not like him, as his taste for splendid living in Greek culture was particularly offensive to them, and a party in the Senate would have recalled him had not the popular enthusiasm in his favor been too strong to be resisted. In 204 he sailed from Lilybaeum and landed near Utica. He was welcomed at Masinissa, whose friendship he had gained in his previous visit to Africa from Spain. Sphinx, however, sided with Carthage, but in 203 Scipio twice defeated him and the Carthaginian forces. Negotiations for peace followed, but the war party in Carthage prevailed. Hannibal was recalled. He returned to fight his last battle with Rome, October 19th, 202, at Zama, a short distance west of Carthage. The issue was decided by the valor of the Roman legions, who loved their commander and trusted his skill. Hannibal met his first and only defeat, and Scipio won his title of Africanus. The battle was a hard one. After all the newly enrolled troops of Hannibal had been killed or put to flight, his veterans who had remained by him in Italy, although surrounded on all sides by forces far outnumbering their own, fought on, and were killed one by one around their beloved chief. The army was fairly annihilated. Hannibal, with only a handful, managed to escape to Hadrumetum. The Battle of Zama decided the fate of the West. The power of Carthage was broken, and her supremacy passed to Rome. She was allowed to retain her own territory intact, but all her warships, except 10, were given up and her prisoners restored. An annual tax of about $200,000 for 50 years was to be paid into the Roman treasury, and she could carry on no war without the consent of Rome. Masinissa was rewarded by an increase in territory, and was enrolled among the allies and friends of the Roman people. Rome was now safe from any attack. She had become a great Mediterranean power. Spain was divided into 2 provinces, and the north of Africa was under her protection. Such was the result of the 17 years' struggle. Scipio was welcomed home, and surnamed Africanus. He enjoyed a triumph never before equaled. His statue was placed in triumphal robes and crowned with laurels in the Capitol. Many honors were thrust upon him, which he had the sense to refuse. He lived quietly for some years, taking no part in politics. This is the end of chapter 15. Chapter 16 through 18 of History of Rome from the earliest times down to 476 A.D. by Robert F. Pennell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Richardson. Chapter 16, Rome in the East. Rome was now in a position to add new nations to her list of subjects. The kingdoms of the East, which formerly composed a part of the vast empire of Alexander the Great, and which finally went to swell the limits of Roman authority, were Egypt, Syria, Macedonia, and Greece proper. Egypt was governed by the Ptolemies, and included at this time the valley of the Nile, Palestine, Phoenicia, and the island of Cyprus, and a number of towns in Thrace. Syria, extending from the Mediterranean to the Indus, was composed of various nations which enjoyed semi-independence. Under incompetent rulers, she saw portion after portion of her dominions fall from her. Thus arose Pergamus, Pontus, Cappadocia, and Phrygia. Macedonia was ruled by Philip V, and included also large portions of northern Greece. Greece proper was divided between the Achaean and the Aetolian leagues, the former including most of the Peloponnesus, the latter the greater part of central Greece. Ever since the repulse of Pyrrhus, Rome had been slowly drifting into closer contact with the East. She formed an alliance with Egypt in 273. From this country had come in part her supply of corn during the Second Punic War. In 205, Ptolemy V became king, and through fear of the Macedonian and Syrian kings, sought the protection of Rome. The punishment of the Illyrican pirates in 228 brought Rome into closer relations with Greece. These connections had been sufficient to open the eastern ports to her trade, but her struggle with Carthage had left her no time or strength to interfere actively in eastern politics until she was forced to take action by the alliance of Philip V of Macedonia and Hannibal, and by the former's threatened invasion of Italy in 214. A small force was sent into Greece, which was soon largely increased by the dissatisfied subjects of Philip. The only object of Rome in the First Macedonian War, 214 to 205, was to prevent Philip from lending aid to Hannibal, and in this she was partially successful. None of the Macedonian troops entered Italy, but 4,000 of them were at Zama. The military operations of this war were of slight importance. Marcus Valerius Laevinus was sent to the Adriatic, and pushed the king so hard that he was obliged to burn the fleet in which he intended to sail for Italy. Philip was at this time at war with Aetolia. Laevinus assisted the Aetolians, and the king was too fully occupied at home to think of operations farther away. But in 205, the Romans, wishing to concentrate their energies upon the invasion of Africa, made peace. Some of Philip's soldiers had been captured at Zama. He demanded their return. The answer was that if he wished war again, he could have it. There were several other reasons which led to the Second Macedonian War in 200 to 197. Philip had agreed with Antiochus III, king of Syria, to attempt with him the division of Egypt. Since it seemed probable that the young king Epiphanes, Ptolemy V, who was only 4 years old, would not be able to make an effectual resistance, the ministers of Egypt sought the protection of Rome. On their journey, the Roman envoys sent to assume the office of protectorship remonstrated with Philip. In Asia Minor, Philip had conducted himself with such barbarity that the people rose against him, and from a similar cause Greece was driven to seek alliances which would protect her against him. Rome was unwilling to undertake a new war, but the people were induced to vote for one, on the representation that the only means of preventing an invasion of Italy was to carry the war abroad. This year, 200, the consul Publius Sulpicius Galba was sent with a considerable force across the Adriatic. His campaign and that of the consul Villius during the next year were productive of no decisive results. But in 198, the consul Titus Quinctius Flamininus, a man of different caliber, conducted the war with vigor. He defeated Philip on the Aus, drove him back to the pass of Tempe, and the next year utterly defeated him at Cynoscephalae. The king had drawn up his forces in two divisions. With the first he broke through the line of the legions, which, however, closed in around him with but little loss. The other division was attacked by the Romans while it was forming, and thoroughly discomfited. The victory of the Romans was decisive. About the same time, the Achaeans captured Corinth from Philip, and the Rhodians defeated his troops at Caria. Further resistance was impossible. Philip was left in possession of Macedonia alone. He was deprived of all his dependencies in Greece, Thrace, and Asia Minor, and was forbidden, as Carthage had been, to wage war without Rome's consent. The next year, 196, at the Isthmian Games, the freedom of Greece was proclaimed to the enthusiastic crowds, and 2 years later Flamininus withdrew his troops from the so-called three fetters of Greece, Chalcis, Demetrius, and Corinth, and urging the Greeks to show themselves worthy of the gift of the Roman people, he returned home to enjoy a well-earned triumph. The chief results of the Second Macedonian War was, therefore, the firm establishment of a Roman protectorate over Greece and Egypt. The wedge had been entered, and the interference of Rome in Eastern affairs was assured. Chapter 17. The Syrian War. Antiochus III of Syria, who had proposed to share Egypt with Philip, had been engaged for some time in a campaign in the east, and did not hear of his allies' danger until too late to aid him. However, he claimed for himself portions of Asia Minor and Thrace, which Philip had previously held, and which Rome now declared free and independent. He crossed the Hellespont into Thrace in 196, but did not dare to enter Greece, although earnestly urged to do so by the Aetolians, until after Flamininus had withdrawn all his troops in 192. Antiochus was no general. Himself irresolute and fond of pleasure, the power behind the throne was Hannibal. This great soldier, after his defeat at Zama, did not relinquish the aim of his life. He became the chief magistrate of his native city, and in a short time cleared the moral atmosphere which was charged with corruption and depravity. Under him Carthage might have risen again, but his intrigues with Antiochus, with whom he wished to make an alliance, gave Rome an opportunity to interfere. His surrender was demanded. He fled, and, after wandering from coast to coast, became the trusted adviser of the Syrian king. Had Antiochus been energetic after his arrival in Greece, he could have accomplished something before the Roman troops came. But he disregarded the warnings of Hannibal, and spent valuable time in minor matters. The Romans arrived in 191, and under Glabrio at Thermopylae drove back the intruder, who hastily retired to Asia Minor. The Aetolians were punished for their infidelity. In 190, Lucius Cornelius Scipio was elected consul and put in command of the army in the east, with the understanding that he should be accompanied by his brother Africanus, and have the benefit of his military skill and experience. Under his command, the Romans crossed the Hellespont and sought Antiochus in his own kingdom. Hannibal could do nothing with the poorly disciplined troops of the king. They were met by the invading forces at Magnesia in Lydia in 190, and 80,000 Asiatics were put to rout by 30,000 Romans, 50,000 being slain. The loss of the victors was slight. On that day the fate of Asia was sealed. Antiochus relinquished all pretensions to any territory west of the river Halys and the Taurus mountains. His chariots, elephants, fleet, and treasures were all surrendered. Scipio returned home to enjoy a triumph and added Asiaticus to his name, as his brothers had taken that of Africanus in commemoration of his victory. Gnaeus Manlius Vulso succeeded Scipio in the east. He made a campaign against the Gauls, who had settled in Galatia about a century before, and had become wealthy by means of constant plunderings. The excuse for the campaign was that they had served in the Syrian army. The reason was their wealth and the ambition of the consul for glory. The Galatians were easily overcome, their wealth seized, and they themselves became assimilated to their neighbors. This war is noticeable chiefly for the reasons that Manlius undertook it without the authority of the Senate, the first instance of its kind, and a precedent which was too frequently followed in later times. On his return to Rome he was allowed a triumph, which stamped his act as legal. These wars in the East brought to Rome immense riches, which laid the foundation of its oriental extravagance and luxury, and finally undermined the strength of the state. From Greece were introduced learning and refinement, from Asia immorality and effeminacy. The vigor and tone of Roman society are nowhere more forcibly shown than in the length of time it took for its subjugation by these ruinous exotics. Meanwhile, at Rome, the political enemies of the Scipios were in the ascendancy. Asiaticus was accused of misappropriating funds obtained during his campaign in the East. As he was about to produce his account books before the Senate, his brother Africanus seized them, tore them to pieces, and threw the remains on the floor. Asiaticus, however, was sentenced to pay a fine. When it was afterwards intimated that his brother too was implicated, he proudly reminded his enemies that their insinuations were ill-timed, for it was the anniversary of Zama. This remark changed the tide of feeling, and no more charges were made. 2 years later, in 183, Africanus died in voluntary exile at Liternum, on the coast of Campania. He had lived little more than 50 years. His wife, Aemilia, was the daughter of Paulus, who fell at Cannae, and the sister of him who afterwards conquered Perseus of Macedonia. His daughter Cornelia afterwards became the mother of the famous Gracchi. Next to Caesar, Scipio was Rome's greatest general. During the campaign in the East, he met Hannibal at the court of Antiochus. In the conversation, Hannibal is reported to have said that he considered Alexander the greatest general, Pyrrhus next, and had he himself conquered Scipio, he would have placed himself before either. Scipio lived to see Rome grow from an Italian power to be practically the mistress of the world. He was of marked intellectual culture, and as conversant with Greek as with his mother tongue. He possessed the charm which made him popular at a time when the culture and arts of Greece were not so courted at Rome as in later days. Hannibal, after the defeat of Antiochus, was demanded by the Romans, but, escaping, took refuge in Crete, and subsequently with Prusias, king of Bithynia. His surrender was demanded, and troops were sent to arrest him. Seeing no way of escape, he opened the bead on his ring and swallowed the poison which it contained in 183. Thus died one of the greatest of commanders without attaining the aim of his life. He had lived but 54 years, yet his life was so marked that people have ever since looked with wonder upon the tremendous magnitude of what he undertook, and came so near accomplishing. The same year is also memorable for the death of the last of the Greeks, Philopoemen. Footnote: see Ancient Greece, page 145. End of footnote. Chapter 18. Conquest of Macedonia and Greece, 171 to 146. Although Philip had aided the Romans in their campaign against Antiochus, he did not receive from them the expected reward in additions to his territory. Immediate resistance would be futile, but he labored patiently and quietly to increase his resources, and to stir up among the neighboring Greeks hostile feeling towards Rome. He placed his army on the best footing possible, and soon began to enlarge his boundaries. Complaints were made to Rome, and the king was compelled to give up his conquest and confine himself to the limits of Macedonia. In 179 Philip died, and was succeeded by his son Perseus. The new king was as able as his father, and more impatient of subjection. He made friends with the surrounding princes, formed a marriage connection with Antiochus IV of Syria, and strove to arouse among the Greeks memories of their former greatness. The Senate, hearing of his numerous intrigues, determined to check him. War was declared in 171, but the forces sent by Rome were at first led by incompetent men, and nothing was accomplished until Lucius Aemilius Paulus was made consul and took charge of the war in 168. Paulus, 229 to 160, was the son of the consul of the same name who was killed at Cannae. His integrity was first shown when Curule Aedile, footnote, see page 225, end of footnote, in 192. He prosecuted persons who had made an illegal use of the public pastures. He was sent to Ulterior, Spain, in 191 as governor, where, after some reverses, he put down all insurrections. He was consul in 182, and did good work in conquering a tribe of marauders in Liguria. For this he was allowed a triumph. He was elected consul a second time in 168, and sent against Perseus. The war was brought to a speedy end by the battle of Pydna on the Thermaic Gulf, June 22nd. The king fled to Samothrace with his treasures and family. He was shortly afterwards captured, but was treated with kindness by the consul. Paulus now traveled through Greece. Later, assisted by commissioners, he arranged the affairs of Macedonia. The country was divided into 4 small republics, independent of each other, but prohibited from intermarriage and commerce with one another. On his return to Rome in 167, he enjoyed a triumph, which was graced by Perseus and his 3 children. He was censor in 164, and died 4 years later. Paulus had 2 sons by his first wife. The elder of these was adopted by Fabius Maximus Cunctator, the younger by the son of Africanus the elder, his brother-in-law. He was of the blue blood of Rome, of perfect honesty, and very popular, a good general, but somewhat superstitious. A patron of learning and the fine arts, he gave his sons the best training under Greek masters. A strong proof of his popularity is the fact that his body was carried to its last resting place by volunteers from the various peoples he had conquered. Perseus spent his last days in confinement near Rome, enduring, it is alleged, base and cruel treatment. He was the last king of Macedonia. After the victory at Pydna, the sympathy shown in Greece for the conquered monarch made the Romans more watchful of her interest there. All suspected to be enemies were removed as hostages to Italy, and among these was the historian Polybius. He lived in Rome for more than 20 years, and became a great friend of the younger Africanus, whom he accompanied to the siege of Carthage. Like Macedonia, Greece was separated into parts, independent of each other, with no rights of connubium or commercium. Utter demoralization soon ensued, which proved a sure preventive to all alliances liable to shake the authority of Rome. Trouble again arose in Macedonia 20 years after Pydna, culminating in what is sometimes called the Fourth Macedonian War, 149 to 146. Under the leadership of Andriscus, who claimed to be a son of Perseus, the people rebelled against the protection of Rome. They were twice defeated in 148 by the praetor Quintus Caecilius Metellus, who gained the agnomen of Macedonicus. The country was made a Roman province, with a Roman magistrate at its head. At this time the Achaeans were quarreling with Sparta. Metellus warned them to desist, and when the Achaeans advanced against him, he easily defeated them near Scarpheia. Metellus was a moderate reformer and a model man. He belonged to an illustrious plebeian gens, the Caecilian. Before his death in 115, 3 of his sons had been consuls, 1 censor, and the 4th was a candidate for consulship. Metellus was succeeded in Greece by Lucius Mummius, a cruel and harsh leader. The remnant of the Achaean army had taken refuge in Corinth. The Senate directed Mummius to attack the city. Its capture in 146 was marked by special cruelties. The city was burned to the ground. Beautiful pictures and costly statuary were ruthlessly destroyed. Gold in abundance was carried to Rome. The last vestige of Greek liberty vanished. The country became a Roman province under the name of Achaia. Corinth, the eye of all Greece, remained in ruins for a century, when it was rebuilt in 46 by Julius Caesar, who planted on its site a colony of veterans and freedmen. This is the end of chapter 18. Chapters 19 through 21 of History of Rome from the earliest times down to 476 A.D. by Robert F. Pennell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Richardson. Chapter 19. The Third Punic War and Fall of Carthage. 50 years had passed since Zama. It was a period of great commercial prosperity for Carthage, but her government was weakening by the quarrels of conflicting factions. Masinissa, king of Numidia, an ally of the Romans, was a continual source of annoyance to Carthage. He made inroads upon her territory, and as she was bound by her treaty not to war upon any allies of Rome, her only recourse was to complain to the Senate. In 157, an embassy was sent to inquire into the troubles. Marcus Porcius Cato, the chief of the embassy, was especially alarmed at the prosperity of the city, and from that time never ceased to urge its destruction. The embassy did not reach any decision, but they allowed matters to go on as they might. Finally, when some sympathizers with Massinissa were banished from the city, he attacked and defeated the Carthaginians, compelled their army to pass under the yoke, and afterwards treacherously destroyed it in 150. Carthage was compelled to give up some of her territory and pay $5,000,000 indemnity. After this victory, matters came to a crisis. The city must be disciplined for warring with an ally of Rome. Cato never failed to close any speech he might make in the Senate with the same cruel words: Delenda est Carthago. Carthage must be destroyed. The people of Carthage were called to account. Desponding and broken-hearted, they sent ambassadors to Rome. The answer given them was obscure. They were requested to make reparation to Rome, and at the same time they were assured that nothing should be undertaken against Carthage herself. But in 149 the consuls crossed with a large army into Sicily, where the troops were organized, and the Carthaginian ambassadors were expected. When they appeared, the consuls declared that the Senate did not wish to encroach upon the freedom of the people, but only desired some security. For this purpose it demanded that, within 30 days, 300 children of the noblest families should be delivered into their hands as hostages. This demand was met. The Romans then coolly crossed over to Africa, and informed the Carthaginians that they were ready to treat with them on any question not previously settled. When the ambassadors again appeared before the consuls, they were told that Carthage must deliver over all her arms and artillery. For, they said, as Rome was able to protect her, there was no need of Carthage possessing arms. Hard as was this command, it was obeyed. They were then told that Carthage had indeed shown her good will, but that Rome had no control over the city so long as it was fortified. The preservation of peace, therefore, required that the people should quit the city, give up their navy, and build a new town without walls at a distance of 10 miles from the sea. The indignation and fury which this demand excited were intense. The gates were instantly closed, and all the Romans and Italians who happened to be within the city were massacred. The Romans, who expected to find a defenseless population, imagined that the storming of the place would be an easy matter, but despair had suggested to the Carthaginians means of defense in every direction. All assaults were repelled. Everybody was engaged day and night in the manufacture of arms. Nothing can be more heart-rending than this last struggle of despair. Every man and every woman labored to the utmost for the defense of the city with a furious enthusiasm. 2 years after the siege began, Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus, the younger, was elected consul while but 37, under the legal age, for the express purpose of giving him charge of the siege. After 2 years of desperate fighting and splendid heroism on the part of the defenders, the famished garrison could hold out no longer. Carthage fell in 146, and the ruins of the city burned for 17 days. The destruction was complete. A part of her territory was given to Numidia. The rest was made a Roman province, and called Africa. The year 149 saw the death of 2 men who had been Carthage's most bitter enemies, but who were not allowed to see her downfall. Massinissa and Cato, the one aged 90 and the other 85. Massinissa's 239 to 149 hostility dates from the time he failed to get the promised hand of Hasdrubal's daughter, Sophonisba, who was given to his rival, Sphinx. After the battle of Zama, most of the possessions of Sphinx fell to Massinissa, and among them this same Sophonisba, whom he married. Scipio, however, fearing her influence over him, demanded her as a Roman captive, whereupon she took poison. Massinissa was a courageous prince, but a convenient tool for the Romans. Cato the Elder, Major, 234 to 149, whose long public career was a constant struggle with the enemies of the state abroad and with the fashions of his countrymen at home, was a type of the old Roman character, with a stern sense of duty that forbade his neglecting the interests of state, farm, or household. In 184, in his capacity as censor, he acted with extreme rigor. He zealously asserted old-fashioned principles and opposed the growing tendency to luxury. All innovations were in his eyes little less than crimes. He was the author of several works, one of which, a treatise on agriculture, has been preserved. Cicero's Cato Major represents him in his 84th year, discoursing about old age with Africanus the Younger, and Laelius, a friend of the latter. Chapter 20. Rome and Spain, the Numantine and Servile Wars, 206 to 132. Africanus the Elder left Spain in 206, after a provincial government of 9 years, 206 to 197. The country was divided into two provinces, separated by the Ebro, and each province was assigned to a praetor. It was some time, however, before Spain was really brought into a state of complete peace and order. The mountains and forests were a formidable obstacle to the Roman legions, and favored guerrilla warfare, which makes conquest slow and laborious. The most warlike of the Spanish tribes was the Celtiberi, who occupied the interior of the peninsula. They were always uncertain and intractable, continually breaking out into new revolt. In 195, Cato the Elder put down a rebellion led by them. He established more firmly the Roman power east of the Iberus. He disarmed the inhabitants of this part of Spain and compelled all from the Pyrenees to the Guadalquivir to pull down their fortifications. Still, the smothering fires of rebellion were not extinguished, for 16 years later, in 179, we find Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, the father of the famous Gracchi, as governor of Spain, fighting the troublesome Celtiberi. He captured over 100 of their towns, but tempered his victories with moderate measures, showing himself greater in peace than in war. He granted to the poorer classes lands on favorable conditions, and did much to produce contentment among the natives. But farther west, in the valleys of the Douro and Tagus, and in Lusitania, Portugal, there seems to have been constant warfare. In 154, Mummius, the same who 8 years later sacked Corinth, was governor of farther Spain. His defeat by the Lusitanians encouraged the Celtiberi to revolt again, and there followed another defeat, with a massacre of many Roman citizens. 2 years later, in 152, Claudius Marcellus avenged these losses, founded Corduba, and governed the country humanely. His successors, Lucius, Lucullus, and Servius Galba, were so cruel and grasping as to drive the Lusitanians into another open rebellion, headed by Viriathus, a bold and daring bandit. During 7 years, 147 to 140, he defeated again and again the armies sent against him. The Celtiberi joined his standards, and Spain seemed likely to slip from the Romans. The only check to these successes was during the command of Metellus Macedonicus in 143. When he was recalled, matters returned to their former condition. In 140, the consul Mancinus was obliged to capitulate, and, to save himself and his army, made a treaty which the Senate refused to sanction. Viriathus was finally, in 139, assassinated by persons hired by the consul Caepio. His people were then subdued, and the government was ably conducted in 138 by Decimus Junius Brutus. The Numantine War in 143 to 133. The Celtiberi, however, were still in arms. The strong city of Numantia, the capital of one of their tribes, witnessed more than one defeat of a Roman consul before its walls in 141 to 140. Finally, Rome sent out her best general, Africanus the Younger. After devoting several months to the disciplining of his troops, he began in 134 a regular siege of the place. It was defended with the utmost bravery and tenacity until, forced by the last extreme of famine, it surrendered in 133. The inhabitants were sold as slaves, and the town was leveled to the ground. The victor was honored with the title Numantinus. The fall of Numantia gave Rome a hold upon the interior of Spain, which was never lost. The country now, with the exception of its northern coast, was normally Roman territory. Several towns were established with Latin municipal rights, municipia, and, on the whole, order was maintained. Along the coast of the Mediterranean there sprang up many thriving and populous towns, which became centers of civilization to the neighboring districts, and were treated by Rome rather as allies than as subjects. Some of them were allowed to coin the silver money of Rome. The civilizing process, due to Roman influence, went on rapidly in these parts, while the interior remained in barbarism. In 105, the peninsula was overrun by the Cimbri, a barbarous race from the north. The country was ravaged, but finally saved by the brave Celtiberi, who forced the invaders back into Gaul. The Servile War in 134 to 132. While the Numantine War was still in progress, a war with the slaves broke out in Sicily, where they had been treated with special barbarity. For a long time, slave labor had been taking the place of that of freemen. The supply was rendered enormous by constant wars and by the regular slave trade carried on with the shores of the Black Sea and Greece. The owners of the slaves became an idle aristocracy. The immediate cause of the outbreak in Sicily was the cruelty of a wealthy slave owner, Damophilus. The leader of the slaves was Eunice, who pretended to be a Syrian prophet. A number of defeats were suffered by the Roman armies until finally Publius Rutilius captured the strongholds of the slaves Tauromenium and Enna, and thus closed the war. For his success he was allowed an ovation. Chapter 21. Internal history. The Gracchi. We have seen how the long struggle between the patricians and plebeians terminated in a normal victory for the latter. From about 275, the outward form of the old constitution had undergone little change. It was nominally that of a moderate democracy. The Senate and offices of state were, in law, open to all alike. In practice, however, the constitution became an oligarchy. The Senate, not the Comitias, ruled Rome. Moreover, the Senate was controlled by a class who claimed all the privileges of a nobility. The Comitias were rarely called upon to decide a question. Most matters were settled by a decree of the Senate, Senatus Consultum. To be sure, the Comitia declared for war or peace, but the Senate conducted the war and settled the conditions of peace. It also usually assigned the commands, organized the provinces, and managed the finances. The causes for this ascendancy of the Senate are not hard to find. It was a body made up of men capable of conducting affairs. It could be convened at any time, whereas the voters of the Comitias were scattered all over Italy, and, if assembled, would not be competent to decide questions demanding knowledge of military matters and foreign policy. The Senate and the Roman nobility were in the main the same. All patricians were nobles, but all nobles were not patricians. The patricians were the descendants of the original founders of the city. The nobles were the descendants of any one who had filled one of the following 6 curule offices, namely, dictator, magister equitum, consul, interrex, praetor, or curule aedile. These nobles possessed the right to place in their hall, or carry in funeral processions, a wax mask of this ancestor, and also of any other member of the family who had held a curule office. A plebeian who first held this office was called a novus homo, or new man. The Senate, thus made up of patricians and nobles, had at this time the monopoly of power. Legally, however, it had no positive authority. The right of the people to govern was still valid, and there was only wanting a magistrate with the courage to remind them of their legal rights and urge the exercise of them. Such a magistrate was found in Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus. With him was ushered in the contest which lasted for more than a century, and brought to the surface some of the proudest names of Roman history. On one side or the other we find them: Marius and Sulla, Caesar and Pompey, Augustus and Antony, arraying Rome against herself, until the glories of the Republic were swallowed up in the misrule and dishonor of the empire. Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus the elder, see chapter 20, belonged to the nobility, but not to the aristocracy. He married Cornelia, the daughter of Africanus the elder. They had 12 children, of whom all but 3 died young. 2 sons and a daughter lived to maturity. The daughter, Sempronia, married Africanus the younger. The sons, Tiberius and Gaius, grew up under the care of their noble and gifted mother, who was left a widow when they were mere boys. Tiberius, 164 to 133, entered the army and served under his brother-in-law during the Third Punic War. 10 years later, in 136, he was quaestor in Spain, where he won the affections of the people by adhering to the mild policy which his father had previously followed. His popular measures here displeased his brother-in-law, and he ceased to be a favorite with him. On his return home, he passed through Tuscany, where he was astonished to see large tracts of the Ager Publicus (see chapter 7), cultivated by slave gangs, while the free poor citizens of the Republic were wandering in towns without employment, and deprived of the land which, according to law, see the Licinian Rogations, should have been divided among them, and not held in large quantities by the rich landowners. Tiberius determined to rectify this wrong. In 133 he offered himself as candidate for the tribuneship, and was elected. He then began boldly to battle for the commons. He proposed to revise the agrarian law, now a dead letter, which forbade the holding of more than 320 acres of the Ager Publicus by one individual. Occupants who had fenced this land and improved it were to be compensated therefor. The wealthy classes in the Senate at once took sides against Tiberius, and the struggle began. One of the other tribunes, Octavius Caecina, who was himself a large landowner, taking advantage of his authority as tribune, interposed his veto to prevent a vote upon the question. Gracchus, full of enthusiasm over the justice of his cause, obtained, contrary to all precedent, the removal of his colleague from office, and passed his agrarian law. 3 commissioners were appointed, himself, his brother, and his father-in-law, Appius Claudius, to carry it into effect. It was contrary to the law that a person should hold the office of tribune for 2 successive years. But Gracchus, in his desire to carry out his plans, determined to violate this rule, and offered himself as candidate for the next year. The election day came, and when it became evident that he would be re-elected, the aristocrats who had turned out in full force on the Campus Martius, with their retinues of armed slaves and clients, raised a riot, and, killing Gracchus with 300 of his followers, threw their bodies into the Tiber in 133. Thus was shed the first blood of the civil struggle. The mob was led by Scipio Nasica, the uncle of Tiberius. Africanus, when he heard of the murder of his brother-in-law, exclaimed, "Justly slain." The agrarian law, however, which had passed, was too evidently just to be openly ignored. The remaining 2 commissioners continued their work until, within 2 years, 40,000 families were settled on tracts of the public land, which the patricians were compelled to vacate. But the commissioners became unpopular, for those who received lands were not always satisfied, and those who were obliged to leave them were enraged. The commissioners were suspended, and the law repealed. The mantle of Tiberius fell on Gaius Gracchus. For a time after his brother's death he retired from politics, and served in the army in Africa and Sardinia, where he was quaestor. His valor, wisdom, and justice made him justly popular, but caused him to be regarded with suspicion at Rome. In 123 he was elected Tribune and twice re-elected. He revived his brother's agrarian law and became at once the avowed enemy of the Senate. As a means of increasing his popularity, he endeavored to admit all the Italians to the privileges of Roman citizenship and to limit the price of bread. Gains gained the favor of the Equites, knights, in commercial class, by carrying through the assembly a law by which all judicial functions were taken from the Senate and entrusted to the knights. Heretofore, all civil and criminal cases of importance had been tried before a jury chosen from the Senate. These juries were often venal and corrupt, and it was a notorious fact that their verdicts could be bought. The transferring of the juries to the Equites made Gaius for a time very powerful. He caused another law to be passed, to the effect that no Roman citizen should be put to death without legal trial and an appeal to the assembly of the people. But the plan of Gaius to extend the franchise to all the Italians ruined his popularity. The Roman citizen had no desire to share their rights with the Etruscans and Samnites. Riots again broke out, as 10 years before. The aristocracy again armed itself. Gaius, with 3,000 of his friends, was murdered in 121, and the Senate was once more master of the situation. However, the results obtained by the Gracchi still remained. 40,000 peasants had been settled on public land. The jury law was in force. No Roman citizen could be put to death without trial, unless the state was held to be in danger. Nearly all Roman writers unite in attacking the reputation of the Gracchi, but viewed in the light of today, their characters were noble, and their virtues too conspicuous to be obscured. A few years previous to this, the younger Africanus died in 129. His remark about the certain death of Tiberius Gracchus gave dire offense to the popular party, and a few days later he was found dead in his bed, probably a victim of political assassination. Africanus was a man of refinement and culture, a warm friend of scholars, a patron of the Greek historian Polybius, and of the poets Lucilius and Terence. He was opposed to the tendency of his age towards luxury and extravagance. He was an orator as well as a general. The one blot on his career is the terrible destruction of Carthage, which he possibly might have averted had he shown firm opposition to it. Scipio Nasica, who led the mob against Tiberius, was compelled through Pontifex Maximus to leave the city and died in exile in Asia. The end of chapter 21. Chapters 22 through 24 of History of Rome from the earliest times down to 476 A.D. by Robert F. Pennell. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Recording by Tony Richardson. Chapter 22. External History. Pergamum. Juguthine War, 118 to 104. Pergamum was an ancient city of Mysia on the Caucasus, 15 miles from the sea. It first became important after the death of Alexander. Its first king, Attalus, 241 to 197, added a large territory to the city. It was an ally of the Romans, and his successors remained their firm friends. The city became one of the most prosperous and famous in Asia Minor, noted for its architectural monuments, its fine library, and its schools. Attalus III, at his death in 133, bequeathed to Rome his kingdom, which included Lydia, Pisidia, Laconia, and Pamphylia. It was made a province under the name of Asia. The war with Jugurtha. After the destruction of Carthage, the most important kingdom in Africa was Numidia. It contained a number of flourishing towns, which were centers of a considerable commerce. Massinissa left his kingdom to his son Micipsa. The latter had two sons and a nephew, Jugurtha. The nephew was a brilliant young man who had served under Scipio in the Numantine War, and returned to Africa covered with honors. He was named joint heir with his cousins to the kingdom of Numidia. Micipsa dying soon after, Jugurtha murdered one of his cousins, Hiempsal, claimed the whole kingdom, and attacked his other cousin at Hannibal, who appealed to Rome. Commissioners were sent to investigate. They were bought off by Jugurtha and returned home without accomplishing anything. Hannibal was afterwards captured, savagely tortured, and finally killed. The Senate, compelled by the popular indignation to make an investigation, moved so slowly that some of its members were accused of accepting bribes. War was declared at last, but the campaign languished, and peace was soon made on such easy terms for the prince that it was evident his money had again been freely used. The scandalous transaction was denounced at Rome by the Tribune Memmius. Jugurtha then repaired to the city in person, and bought up all the authorities except Memmius, whom he found incorruptible. He had another cousin in the city whom he caused to be murdered. After this, the Senate ordered him to leave, and as he departed, it is said he exclaimed, "Venal city, destined soon to perish, if a purchaser be found." War was now begun in earnest in 110, but resulted in a crushing defeat of the Romans, whose army was sent under the yoke. Humiliated by the defeat, the Senate in the following year sent Quintus Caecilius Metellus, nephew of Metellus Macedonicus, to take charge of the war. He was a man of integrity, with some experience as an officer, and a rigid aristocrat. Realizing the danger of failure, he took with him as his lieutenant the ablest soldier that he could find, Gaius Marius. Marius, born at Arpinum in 157, was the son of a farmer, and was himself bred to the plough. He joined the army at an early age, and soon attracted notice for his punctual performance of all duties, and his strictness in discipline. He was present at the siege of Numantia, and his courage caused Scipio to predict for him a brilliant career. He soon rose to be military tribune. In 119 he was chosen tribune of the people, and 2 years later praetor. The fact that he was respected and valued in high circles is shown by his subsequent marriage into the family of the Caesars. By this marriage with Julia, the aunt of Julius Caesar, he became a person of social distinction. The campaign was moderately successful. Jugurtha was defeated near the river of Muto and made to retire into the desert, where his stronghold, Thala, was captured. He sued for peace, but as unconditional surrender was demanded, he still held out. The popular party at Rome, irritated that such a petty prince should give so much trouble, demanded that Marius should be made consul and have charge of the war. When the lieutenant asked Metellus for leave of absence to enable him to be present at the elections, as was necessary according to the law, his general ridiculed the idea and told him to wait another 20 years. He went, however, and was elected in 107, being the first plebeian chosen to that office for more than a century. Metellus was recalled, enjoyed a triumph, and received the agnomen of Numidicus. Marius was every inch a soldier. He saw that the Roman legions must be recognized and better disciplined. He enlisted men who had no other occupation, that they might become professional soldiers. Some men of rank who had a taste for war also went with him. Among these was a young patrician, Cornelius Sulla. With this army, Marius soon wrested from Jugurtha all his strongholds. In less than 2 years the war was over. By his ally, Bocchus, king of Mauritania, Jugurtha was betrayed, 106, into the hands of Sulla, who was acting as the quaestor of Marius. The western portion of Numidia was given to Bocchus as the reward of his treachery, while the remainder continued to be governed by native princes until the civil war between Caesar and Pompey. In 104, Marius returned home and entered Rome in triumph. Jugurtha was thrown into a dungeon and there starved to death. Chapter 23. The Cimbri and Teutones. Political quarrels. The war with Jugurtha ended none too soon, for Marius was needed in a struggle requiring all his talents. The Cimbri and Teutones, barbarous nations from northern Europe, were threatening the frontiers of Italy. Already the Roman armies had met with 5 successive defeats at their hands on the banks of the Rhone. 80,000 Romans and 40,000 camp followers are said to have fallen in these battles. Had the barbarians at this moment chosen to enter Italy, the destruction of Rome would have been a certain result. Fortunately, they turned to the Pyrenees and, sweeping over the mountains, overran for a season the province of Spain. Marius, appointed consul a second time, devoted his energies to forming and training the army. He selected the plains on the banks of the Rhone in southern Gaul as best adapted for his purpose. Here he drilled his troops, accustoming them to the greatest possible exertions. Many perished under the strain, but the survivors became hardened soldiers. Corps of engineers were attached to each legion, and the soldiers were taught the use of tools as well as of arms. At length, in his 4th consulship in 102, he felt prepared to meet the enemy. The barbarians, on their return from Spain, separated their forces, the Cimbri marching around the northern foot of the Alps towards Noricum, with the intention of invading Italy from that quarter, while the Teutones remained in Gaul. As the latter advanced, Marius took up his position in a fortified camp near Quesextiae. He allowed the enemy to march past him, and then followed cautiously, waiting for a favorable opportunity to fall upon them. In the battle that followed, the barbarians were no match for the drilled legionaries, who were irresistible. The contest lasted 2 days, and the vast host of the Teutones was cut to pieces. 20 July 102. At the close of this battle, word was brought to Marius that he had been elected consul for the 5th time. Meanwhile, the Cimbri had crossed the Alps and were ravaging the fertile fields of Lombardy, meeting with but slight opposition from the Catulus, the other consul. The next year Marius came to his rescue. Universally, the Cimbri met the same fate as their brethren, and Italy was saved in 101. No sooner was the danger from the invasion over than political quarrels broke out at Rome with great fury. Marius was elected consul for the 6th time. The popular heroes of the hour were 2 demagogues, the Tribune Saturnius and the Praetor Gallucia. They carried corn laws and land laws. Footnote: these were the Apuleian laws in 100. 1. Any Roman citizen could buy corn of the state at a nominal price. 2. The land in Cisalpine Gaul, which the Cimbrians had occupied, should be divided among the Italian and Roman citizens. 3. Colonies from the veterans of Marius were to be founded in Sicily, Achaia, and Macedonia. End of footnote. And compelled the senators to take an oath to execute their laws. Metellus Numidicus, refusing to comply with their wishes, Saturninus sent a guard to the Senate house, dragged him out, and expelled him from the city. During this troublesome time, Marius showed that he was no politician. He lacked judgment and firmness, and by endeavoring to please all parties, he pleased none. On the popular side, there were 2 parties: the moderate one led by Memmius, who had exposed the Senate in its dealings with Jugurtha, and the radical one led by Saturninus and Glaucia. Memmius and Glaucia both ran for the consulship, and as the former seemed likely to be successful, he was murdered. A reaction then set in, and Saturninus and Glaucia were declared public enemies. They took refuge in the Senate house, the roof of which was torn off, and the wretches were stoned to death. The fall of Saturninus and Glaucia was followed in 99 by the recall of Metellus from banishment. He died shortly afterwards, and it was suspected that he was a victim of treachery. Marius, having now become generally unpopular on account of his vacillating course in the recent troubles, went into voluntary exile, traveling through Asia Minor and visiting the court of Mithradátes, king of Pontus. For the next 8 years, 99 to 91, Rome enjoyed a season of comparative quiet. Chapter 24. Internal history, the social war from 90 to 88. At this time, there was a bitter rivalry between the Senate and the equestrian order, or commercial class. From the former were chosen the governors of the provinces. From the latter came the tax gatherers, the publicani, and the money brokers, the negotiatores. It will help us to understand better the condition of affairs if we study the composition of the Senate and the equites. The senators, 300 in number, later their number was increased to 600, held their office for life. When vacancies occurred from death or occasionally from removal, they were filled by the censor. Footnote: see the duties of the censor. End footnote. Who appointed a person that had held one of the following offices: dictator, consul, praetor, curule aedile, or, after the time of Sulla, quaestor. All persons who had held these offices, or that of tribune, were allowed to join in debate in the Senate, but not to vote. No senator could engage in business, hence he must be wealthy. We saw in chapter 4 that Roman citizens were divided into 6 classes according to their property, and that these classes were subdivided into 193 other classes called centuries. About 225, the number was increased to 373. 18 of the centuries of the first class were called equites, and must have property worth $20,000 or more. This name was given to them because at first they served in the army as horsemen, though in later times the cavalry was composed only of allied troops. The equites were originally from the aristocracy alone, but as the plebeians increased in wealth, many of them became rich enough to be included in this class. There was no hostility between the Senate and the equites until, in 123, Gaius Gracchus passed the Lex Judicaria, which prescribed that the jurors judices should be chosen from the equites, and not the Senate. From this time dates the struggle between the two classes, and the breach widened every year. On the one side were the nobles, represented by the Senate; on the other side the equestrian order. Since the jurors were chosen from the latter, it had control of the courts, and often made an unscrupulous use of its power, especially in those courts which were established to try governors for extortion in the management of provinces (quaestiones rerum repetundarum). From the equites too were taken the tax gatherers of the provinces. They pillaged and robbed the people at will, and if a governor had the courage to interfere with them, a threat of prosecution was held over his head. The average governor preferred to connive at their exactions. The bolder ones paid with fines or exiles for their courage. Another trouble was threatening the commonwealth. The Italian allies of Rome did not possess the franchise belonging to a Roman citizen. For nearly 2 centuries they had shared dangers and victories with the Romans. They now eagerly demanded all their privileges. In 91, Marcus Livius Drusus, the Tribune, took up the task of reform. He was noble, wealthy, and popular, and he hoped to settle the question peacefully and equitably. But his attempt to reform the courts displeased the equites. His agrarian and corn laws made him many enemies, and his attempt to admit the Italians to the rights of Roman citizenship aroused great opposition. His laws were passed, but the Senate pronounced them null and void. He was denounced in that body as a traitor, and was struck down by an assassin in the same year. The death of Drusus drove the Italians to despair. 8 nations entered into a close alliance, chose Corfinium in the Pelignian Apennines as their capital, and formed a federal republic, to which they gave the name Italia. All Italians were to be citizens of Confinium, and here was to be the place of assembly and the Senate house. Rome, in the face of this danger, acted promptly and with resolution. The consuls Lucius Julius Caesar and Publius Rutilius Lupus both took the field. With each were 5 lieutenants, among whom were Marius and Sulla. This war in 90 to 88, called the Social War, that is, the war with the allies, the Socii, was at first disastrous to Rome. The allies overran Campania, defeated the Romans several times, and entered into negotiations with the northern Italians, whose fidelity began to waver. It is not strange, therefore, that opinions at Rome began to be turned in the direction of a more liberal policy. It was decided to make concessions. Towards the close of the year 90, the consul Caesar carried the Julian law, by which the Roman franchise was extended to all who had not yet revolted. The next year this law was supplemented by the Plutian Papirian law, which allowed every citizen of an Italian town the franchise, if he handed in his name to the praetor at Rome within 60 days. About the same time was passed another law, the Calpurnian, which permitted Roman magistrates in the field to bestow the franchise on all who wished it. These laws resulted in disorganizing the rebellion. The Samnites and the Lucanians held out the longest, but were finally put down by Marius. The end of the Social War brought no peace at Rome. The newly enfranchised Italians were not fully satisfied. The Senate was torn asunder by violent personal rivalries. There was no class not affected by the widespread tightness in the money market. The treasury was empty, and many capitalists became insolvent. War with Mithradátes, king of Pontus, had been declared, and both Marius and Sulla were eager to have the command. At this time, in 88, the Tribune Publius Sulpicius Rufus brought forward the following bills: 1. That the command of the war against Mithradátes be given to Marius. 2. That the new citizens should be distributed through all the tribes. 3. That any senator who owed more than $400 be deprived of his seat. 4. That those exiled on suspicion of having aided in the Italian revolt be recalled. In spite of the bitterest opposition, these bills were passed, but the triumph of Sulpicius was of short duration. Sulla, who with his troops had been encamping near Nola in Campania, marched upon the city, and for the first time a consul entered Rome at the head of his legions. End of chapter 24.